Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core Podcast, a podcast where we reach into the core of the .NET technology stack and with the help of the .NET community, present you with the information that you need in order to grok the many moving parts of one of the biggest cross-platform multi-application frameworks on the planet. I am your host, Jamie Gaprogman-Taylor, and in this episode I talked with Harry Bellamy about the differences between supporting both Greenfield and Brownfield applications in both .NET Core /5 and .NET Framework. Along the way, we also talk about some of the technologies which didn't make the transition over to Core /5, such as web forms and WCF. This is actually part one of our discussion, and a second part with more of a discussion on the enterprise and how fast .NET is moving, coming very soon. So keep an eye out for that episode. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. First thing I'd like to say, Harry, thank you ever so much for being on the show. We were in a strange set of circumstances throughout the world, and it's not so easy to find a lot of time for a lot of things. And you're looking at me going, I've got all the time in the world, mate. What are you talking about?
Well, I'm not sure I'd go that far, but no, thanks a lot for having me, Jamie. We've been discussing doing this for a while now, haven't we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what I thought would be a good idea, if it's okay with you, Harry, is a quick introduction to yourself so that the listeners know who you are, what you're talking about, that kind of thing. Let's do that.
Yes, yeah. Hello, my name's Harry Bellamy. I've been a software developer for almost longer than I'd care to remember. About 13 and a half years now. I've worked in a variety of industries, including automotive, healthcare, sports. I've worked in consultancies where I've had some of that experience, as you might imagine. Most of my career, I've been using C# and .NET. So I started in .NET Framework 2, and I followed it all the way through to where we are right now, or maybe slightly behind where we are right now. I'm not quite upon the new hotness that is 5, but I've seen a few bits around it. But yes, and yeah, I'm always talking about clean code and brownfield code and how to make your code and coding experience better.
Excellent. We have actually discussed a little bit about legacy / brownfield code a little bit on Tabs and Spaces, which is another show that I am part of, and you were on as a featured guest. But let's quickly, if you don't mind, go over what legacy, brownfield, and greenfield, and new, and all these words that, because I like just today I talked to a Canadian friend and they were like, "What's brownfield?" So for the purposes of setting expectations, let's talk about what brownfield is, what legacy means to you, and then hopefully we can figure out what greenfield is, right?
Well, I'm going to be slightly awkward here, actually. Sorry, Jamie. I think I might start the other way around. I might start with what greenfield is.
Totally, yeah. Let's do that.
Greenfield is like, you've got a blank canvas, a greenfield, if you will, and there's nothing there, and you're building something from scratch. No existing code, and the world is your oyster. You can start and write it in whatever technology you want. Obviously, it's going to be C# and .NET because you're listening to this podcast. So that's where you can start, and you've got a blank canvas. So brownfield, I presume the word brownfield comes sort of from greenfield, effectively. So somebody's corrupted the phrase or the word that way. Brownfield is where you've got something which is existing. And you have to modify that, and you carry on maintaining that to either to implement functionality for a customer or your business, the company you work for, or you're in maintenance mode and you're trying to make it better, or you're trying to make sure you get rid of bugs, etc., etc. So now legacy is where I think there's maybe a bit more ambiguity here. Because how does legacy code differ from brownfield code? So the definition I've heard, which I quite like, although it could be slightly controversial, is that I think this is from Roy Osherov, who wrote a .NET book about unit testing, the art of unit testing. That's it. And his definition is any code which doesn't have unit tests is legacy code. So even if you've just written it, it's legacy code, which is maybe a slightly controversial and slightly sort of almost slightly worrying thought. But I think I can see why that he's described it as that, and I can see why you would think of it that way, because if you don't have if you don't have unit tests, you've almost got no documentation. You've got no starting point to work from.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. It's very, we talk about how the person who writes if I write some code today and then in 6 months' time I look at that code, I'm not that same person. I don't have the same context. I don't have the same thought process behind it. So that could be legacy code, right? Because I'm not that same person anymore. I've had 6 months of experience of doing other things and life getting in the way. But if I write the code now, like you say, and I've not documented it via either code as documentation, or documentation as code, or whatever you want to call it, or via any kind of tests, unit tests, integration tests, whatever, then yeah, it may as well have been written by someone else, because I am not the same person that I was 30 seconds ago when I hit save. I mean, if I'm using Visual Studio, it's 4 seconds ago because I'm constantly hitting save. But I'm not that same person anymore. So I totally get that. I get why that is the definition.
Yeah, I think it's a good rule to abide by, and I think thinking things in that way makes you maybe a little bit more critical about how you handle your own sort of coding life, or coding cleanliness, for want of a better phrase.
Mm-hmm. and yeah, that totally makes sense. But we're not here to talk specifically about the differences between legacy and brownfield and greenfield and orange field or purple field. I'm not, I don't care. I don't care what color the field is. Let's just build some lovely software. But we are going to talk about brownfield / legacy / supporting all of that stuff, which is something that you are an expert in, I have to say.
I wouldn't use the word expert, but I've got I've got quite a lot of experience and quite a few scars in it.
That's the first 3 letters of expert. You're like what? Oh, a third of the way there, half the way there.
Yeah, I'm half the way there. Really half the way there.
Yeah, exactly.
As far as most of us probably want to go, but
okay, so. For the folks who are new to .NET, maybe they've only just started with .NET 5 or .NET Core or whatever, they may not know of the unique challenges of working with legacy code written in Framework, because for them, Framework and Core and 5, because it's all .NET, right? It's all super simple. You just go into Visual Studio, you go file new project, and it's all there, right? You don't have to worry about installing loads of stuff. So I was wondering, could you talk real quick about the any of the unique challenges that you've found in supporting all of those .NET Framework apps before we talk about the new hotness of Core /5/6, 7, 8, 9, all that kind of stuff?
Oh, so if you're not interested in a back in my day kind of episode, I advise you probably to turn off now. But this may end up being just me and Jamie sharing war stories. Let's hope it stays valuable for everybody. But yeah, so I mean, going back to the .NET sort of 2 days, let's go right back to the beginning of when I got involved with .NET, and. So this would have been, this would be sort of 2010. And yes, okay, stuff like CI/CD did exist, but it didn't exist in every single place. And so there was a lot of, building it on your own machine. And unbelievably, stuff like the web, or the internet, as you may know, you may refer to it as, that it was not necessarily the first way that you'd think of deploying applications, which seems shocking. So a lot of the applications I worked on were Windows Forms and desktop, which amazingly we still use it now. Some of us do. It's amazingly quick for prototyping. I still don't think there's anything which beats it, especially now that the .NET core version works in the latest version of Visual Studio. But anyway, I digress. So we had these, you have these desktop apps which might take in third-party dependencies, and the first problem you're thinking, well, what's the problem with third-party dependencies? Well, NuGet didn't really exist it didn't exist until Visual Studio 2010 or 2012. So in the .NET 2, .NET 3.5 days, or certainly .NET 2, you'd have to drag in external dependencies by copying a DLL from a third-party vendor's site, or stick it in like that, and it would become pretty clunky. And you also to take in any of some of Microsoft's Microsoft's dependencies, you might have to put them in something called a Windows installer. And you'd have to install those things on your machine, and then you'd get lovely, it works on my machine issues because, Jeff has not got the Visual Studio 2008 redistributable installed on his machine. Again, if you don't know what these things are, you're probably going to have to do some serious Googling here. Or possibly go back on the Wayback Machine or something like that. But they were challenging times, and things weren't as streamlined. And we didn't have something like Azure DevOps to be able to run these pipelines with, and we didn't have the tooling of the .NET command line. If you could script MS Build, which is what Visual Studio does in the background anyway, but you'd have to be scripting MS Build was not as nice a experience as scripting for .NET.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd find, so you'd end up building it on your own machine, trying to figure out how to alter the XML of a Windows installer, or maybe a Wix installer if you were so inclined. Yeah, XML, guys, not JSON. What's JSON? Yeah. Who's Jason? Oh, God, sorry. I can't believe I said that. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. Oh, can we take
2021 and you've made that joke.
I know. I'm showing my my age here, aren't I? Oh, dear.
To be fair, whenever I have to send a message to my friend Jason, I said it there, my friend Jason. I actually type out JSON because I'm just like, oh, no, it's not. And it happens every single time just because I'm always typing like if my job entitled typing Apple every single day, I'm sure that I would end up typing Apple in all of my, like, everything I do, text messages, WhatsApp, whatever, right? Because that's what it would just be muscle memory. Because muscle memory for typing JSON with shift on is, and it sounds exactly the same when you say it out loud. So I totally get why you made that joke.
Yeah, it doesn't excuse it though, does it?
No, that's true.
No.
I was just trying to give you time to think of an excuse.
I can't justify it. I appreciate it, but I can't. But yeah. So again, I'm trying not to make it. So it was so hard an hour a day. But so there are some, and if you've ever upgraded a framework project to core. Yes, it's very similar, but there are some sort of important differences where, and one of the main ones I can find is that, or I found sort of on the move to core from framework, is that there's no first party, there's no Microsoft supplied DI container, IOC container. So particularly with older framework code, it's not designed around dependency injection, or if you're lucky somebody might have done that, but because often I find, because if the base framework doesn't support it, people tend not to do it, especially when it was done quite a few years ago, because I don't know how old the oldest IOC container is for framework. Be using probably nhibernate, I would think, as the... No, so nhibernate's an ORM, sorry. Something like Ninject or Autofac, I would have thought.
Yeah, I'm not sure myself. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And then you move from one project that uses Ninject to Autofac, or the other way around. And because they are written by completely different teams, but they're they're solving the same problem, but in two different ways.
Yes, I think now we've standardized on one JSON library. Actually, no, let's not go down that route either. But yeah, there's something to be said for the industry standardizing on a particular library, isn't there? Yes, granted, there are some downsides to it as well, but especially if that library goes away. But Microsoft seems to stop these things happening, don't they?
Mm. Yep. I do have to say that I remember, just because you talked about just the security implications of let's download a random DLL, throw it into my app.
How's that? Well, let me play devil's advocate there, though. But how does that differ from NuGet or NPM?
Well, yes, okay, yeah, you're absolutely right. There's an implicit trust that it hasn't been altered after it's gotten to the NuGet server, and presumably because it's open source, you can click a button and see the source. I mean, technically, a NuGet package is just a zip file, so you could just inspect it and open it up, and that's what you're supposed to do. If listeners want to check that out, go back to episode 69 with Niels Tannis, and that's one of the ways that you can inspect that the code that is running on your machine in your build server is what it says it is, because we've had, I'm sure it'll happen with NuGet at some point, but we've had it with node packages where it's a Bitcoin miner running on your build server, right? And that's just because, for better or worse, people go npm install, return, okay, done. I've solved the problem, and they don't bother checking the actual code that's running. But then it's a non-trivial problem to solve, because
you could argue it's a
one
full-time
package
job.
pulls down a million other packages, right?
I mean, there is some stuff built into npm, isn't there, for sort of auditing purposes? But that seems, I guess, that's a bit more like after the horse has bolted, isn't it? Yeah. Yes, it's useful, so more useful than after the horse has bolted. But you see my point.
It stops the rest of the horses bolting.
Yes.
Yes.
What are the there could be multiple. There could be multiple horses. Yeah.
Yes. Let's say you have all the horses.
Yes, but one of them bolts.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And yeah, you're right. Standardizing around one pattern. There we go, design patterns, right? Standardizing around one pattern that a specific library uses can be really helpful, because then, you don't have to remember the millions of different syntaxi? I don't know what plural of syntaxes. Multiple different ways of doing the same thing. So, yeah, even like, I've got it written down here. For folks who don't know, we have a document that we plan everything out on. DLL hell. Do you remember that with the different version numbers? DLL bindings?
Fun. Oh.
That was, yeah. So, for those who don't know, if you're new to .NET or you just don't know about it, you could redirect a version of a framework. Let's say you have, not of a framework. Let's say you have a DLL that was version 3.1.0.0, right? And then you download the update and it's actually 3.2.0.0. You could tell, without having to change your code, you could tell the system, I'm going to ship with the wrong version of the DLL, but just pretend that it's right. Don't worry about it. Like, here's version 3.1, but I've said get through version 3.2, but just pretend that 3.1 is 3.2, and you get into this horrible level of, I think it was called dependency redirects, was it?
Assembly redirect, I think.
That's it, assembly redirects. And that was horrendous, because then you get to a position where, like I said, somebody's updated something down the line, but you're depending on it, which depends on something else, which depends on something else. And none of the versions match anymore. And the problem with that is your app doesn't boot.
It goes, I can't find this. Yeah. I think that there was a bit of controversy, wasn't there, when .NET Core was announced, or when it was released, that it didn't support assembly redirects.
Yep. And I think that was, I'm pretty sure that it was Imo Landworth that said, I don't want that headache, and you don't want that headache. So, no, it doesn't support it because I said. That was me paraphrasing what he'd said, by the way.
But having said that, I know we said we weren't going to move on to core just yet. Having said that, NuGet packages do support. Don't they have patterns to say that I support this version and anything above, or they support version ranges? So I might support. A package might support. A dependency between versions 3 and 3.9 or 3 and 4.
Yeah, it's similar to how NPM by default will give you, if you say install left pad version 7, what usually happens is in the package.json, I believe, it'll add a hat before the version 7 number, and that essentially means version 7 or higher. And you can do something very similar with .NET. Now, the tooling will actually tell you, if you are building that library yourself, hey, no, give me a specific version. I'm allowing you to supply this special character or these special characters, which means between these version numbers or this version number or higher, but pin it, please. And anyone who's ever done .NET Core stuff and chosen to reference, I think it's Microsoft. It's one of the meta packages. If you reference one of the meta packages, we'll talk about that in a minute, which is a package of packages. If you reference that but don't give a version number, you get a build warning, not a build error, saying, hey, pin me to a specific version number, please. And then you pin it, and then it says, no, you shouldn't pin me to that version number, so it doesn't match the tooling that you're using. And then you get into this annoying loop of, oh, I haven't got the right tooling installed.
Yeah, I know the one you mean. I think it's, isn't it, ASP.NET Core.all.
That's it.
So certain versions it complains if you pin, and some versions it complains if you don't pin.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I think it's the other way around. I think later versions complain if you do pin. Yeah, It's great fun.
Yeah, because just to go into that, I believe it's because the .NET SDK now ships with a pre-jitted version of the ASP.NET Core All package. So then if you pin it, if you're building against .NET 5 and you pin it to the version 3.1 of the package, it's going to be like, hey, there is a mismatch here because I'm using the wrong version.
Yeah, I think after 3 or from 3 onwards, you could specify the target SDK, and that would determine which version you're using rather than pinning it using NuGet. It'd take it from the SDK instead.
Or something along those lines. It's all this complicated NuGet nonsense.
So we said we weren't going to talk about.
Yeah, right. But okay, so we talked about .NET Framework. That is a thing that came around in 2002 and has been around for a long time, and it will still continue to be around. It was originally, I'm just going to take the handle here to give you a bit of a rest here, Harry. Just real quick while I cover some stuff about Framework. .NET Framework was originally designed as a intranet-only, Microsoft Windows-only thing to help you build applications, and it became really big, and it is wonderful, albeit very slow, and based on like you said, Harry, it doesn't have IOC containers built in. It doesn't have there's a lot of stuff that it doesn't do by default. ASP.NET Core was something ASP.NET was something added after the fact, and it was, for want of a better phrase, shoehorned in. I don't want that to sound like it was kind of, let's just kind of do half a job. It was really well done, but it was added after. And there are things that, there are decisions there that lots of backwards compatibility. But then Core came along, and the first thing you need to know about Framework and Core is Core is an open source cross-platform version of Framework, and that means you can run your .NET apps anywhere you want. Quite literally, I've seen a .NET app running on a fridge, because why not, right? And the other thing to know is that, yes, Core is getting the new updates and new features, but Framework is not going away. And the reason for that is because Windows itself requires .NET Framework. So as long as Windows is a thing, .NET Framework will always be a thing. It will always get the security updates, but it won't get performance updates or anything like that. And the main reason for that is because now we have millions of apps running Framework. I say we, I'm not affiliated with Microsoft. This is all based on stuff I've read that Microsoft have put out there. There are millions and billions of apps running on Framework. And Framework is tied to Windows. So when a new version of Framework comes out, it has to go out with Windows Update, which means that all of the scenarios for every single line of code that could possibly be run in a .NET Framework app have to be tested before it can get released with Windows. And even then, it can only go out with the major Windows revisions. So then you only get the updates if it's ready on a specific, like every couple of months or something. So it gets to a point where it's quite difficult to manage. And so that's where Framework and Core and 5, that's where we have all these different things.
Yeah, and I think just as related to that, the original, I believe the original sort of statement around .NET was, I think it's 23 languages, something like that. If you look originally, there's a huge number of languages that support .NET, and so that the original sort of mission statement was 23 languages, one platform. Mm-hmm. And now we have one, maybe two languages, sort of C# and F#, VB.NET. Well, I don't want to say anything about that because I don't want to offend anybody, and I don't want to. It's not my area of expertise, so I don't want to say anything incorrect for fear of angering Microsoft. Yeah. So now we have any platform you can think of, pretty much, but only these two languages, and I think we can all agree what's probably more useful.
Mm-hmm. So it's like with cooking, right? If you've got a million different ingredients and you're going to produce something that everyone loves and it's wonderful, why not boil that down to a handful of ingredients with a handful of steps and still produce the same thing, right? Because then it's simpler to do. You might be technically more capable if you can do the million ingredient recipe, but if you can do exactly the same thing with 4 or 5 or a handful, then you're going to be faster, right? Or you're going to be more productive, or you're going to produce more, or the quality of your code or the quality of the stuff that you produce is probably going to be better because it's less complex. So let's boil that down. Let's just remove all the stuff that isn't really required. 23 languages down to 2/3. I mean, I think Windows 10 still ships with the VB.NET compiler, so maybe, but...
Yeah, and I mean, can you imagine if it still supported 23 languages now? Can you imagine how bad Stack Overflow would be trying to find anything out about .NET? No, I'm using the C++ version of .NET.
Yeah. So I'm writing some Go in .NET on a Linux server that's talking to my fridge, and the microservices connecting to them uses gRPC and eventually ends up on the blockchain. What do?
Should have used Python.
That's it.
Yep.
Absolutely. The answer is always should have used Python. No.
Yes. Yeah.
So we've covered a little bit about what Core is. Now, before we talk about 5, 6, 7 and why there's no .NET 4, what's your experience been with supporting legacy / brownfield apps in Framework versus Core? Or rather, in Core versus Framework is what I meant to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's supporting sort of brownfield legacy projects in Core it's been so much easier. I started talking about the CLI, and the CLI. It's amazing how we go full circle on these things. That we didn't have a lot of choice other than to use CLI applications back in the 70s and 80s, and then the 90s. 3D accelerators, 2D accelerators. Graphics cards for those of us that don't remember computing in the 90s. So and then everything becomes GUIs, doesn't it? And now we've gone full circle, and we're back to CLIs being the the new hotness. It's not a JavaScript framework unless it's got a CLI. You can't take it seriously if it's not got CLI. But joking aside, it makes being able to maintain the software so much easier because it's the first step to being able to do CI/CD. Is I can script my builds. Now I have a transferable script or transferable script that I can run anywhere, and I should get the same thing out at the end. And that also means that I can run that in a Docker container as well, if I'm so inclined. I mean, can you imagine, let's have a thought experiment. Can you imagine how you would get a .NET Framework app running in a Docker container?
I mean, you can do ASP.NET Framework. I put the inflection on the wrong part of the word there. But yeah, there are Windows 10 containers or container images for running ASP.NET Framework apps. But they are not the easiest things to set up, is how I'll put it.
Aren't they also several gigabytes in size?
They are, yes. Because it has to ship with the entirety of Windows. Because that's the other thing with Core or Framework, right? With Framework, when you run your app, you would technically only have to install the app and its dependencies. You would make you would take the risk that .NET Framework version X was already installed on the machine because it was going to run on Windows, and Windows will pre-install that for you because it's required by Windows. But that meant that, all told, your app size would be however big an installation of Windows is, plus your app, plus your dependencies. And so that meant that none of your code could be modularized, right? None of your dependencies could be modularized. But with Core, I remember they were talking about it in the 3.1 days, the .NET Core 3.1 days of doing experimental tree shaking to go, hey, you've pulled in this massive DLL, this huge chunk of library in a NuGet package, but you're only ever using one method. So we'll just recompile that, just give you the version with the one method, and your dependency drops from 11 megabytes down to 27 kilobytes. Newtonsoft.json.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, there's so much more they can do with it. Having the faster release cadence means that there's so much more. There's so much more that can be done. But so start as soon as you got the CLI and you can have an efficient CI/CD pipeline. Yes, okay. I mean, maybe being slightly tongue in cheek there. It is possible to Dockerize framework apps, but I think you'd probably have a much easier time doing Dockerizing a core app. But let's say we're trying to build a desktop app and we want to do a CI/CD pipeline for our .NET Framework desktop app, and we need to build the installer in Azure DevOps.
I mean, you just do Control-Shift-B inside of Visual Studio after changing it to release, and then copy the files out. And then you open whatever app it is that you're using to build your installer locally and go File, Open, Install Script, and then hit Build or Run, and then watch that fall over because it's looking at the wrong folder. Then you fix all of that. And then you end up with an exe that's maybe 40, 50, if you're lucky, 40, 50 megabytes, maybe 200 megabytes in size. And then you got to get that out to the customer client user. So then you put a random exe, unsigned, on your website for users to download and run. Unsigned.
Yep. That's pretty much what happens. I just had a flashback there, that I've not had for ages, and the flashback is .cab files. Cabinet files.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
So a cabinet file was like a dumping ground for all your data.
Yep.
And
early Windows, that.
Yep. I was still doing that 10 years ago, cabinet files.
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe not 10 years ago, but still.
So this is you saying, hey, you framework people, if you think you had it easy.
Yes. You didn't have to worry about installers and cabinet files.
Oh my goodness. But I think that's where Core shines, because yes, you've got this tree shaking stuff, but it's built into the CLI, like you said. Once you have that CLI, you can script it. And for those of you who haven't used the CLI, the command line, whatever, you can literally, if you have a terminal open, a command prompt open in the directory where your source code exists, you can type in .dotnet space and type in the word run, and it will figure out where to start and build your application. If you type in .NET publish, it will do the publish for you. It takes all of your stuff, wraps it up in a NuGet package, dumps it onto disk for you. Right? None of this figuring out how to build your pipeline or anything. And then you combine that with a GitHub action and Azure DevOps action that just does that one command. and you've got something that immediately, as soon as you hit git commit and then git push, if you're using Git as your source control, then you can immediately build straight away, and you can have multiple builds, and then you can do .NET test. You can do, oh my goodness, what else is there?
There's all kinds. There's .NET EF. There's the entity framework. It supports adding migrations, running migrations. So yeah, you've got a common. I mean, it's actually a separate tool, but it's you have to install it separately. But if you use Azure DevOps, it will be pre-installed. So you can go .NET EF update database, and it'll pull the details out of your app config. It's still not actually the most elegant way of doing it right now. I think they've changed it for one of the later versions, or they're in the process of changing it, so you can actually pass a connection string to it. But it actually had to go from your startup app config, which is not the best experience. But nonetheless, it will allow you to go .NET update. Here's your startup project. Here's your database project, and bang, there it goes. You need to write that. You can write that once. It's in your build pipeline. It's in your pipeline YAML if you're using that, and then boom, off it goes.
Yep.
And you can script that for different environments if you've got a multi-environment build. It's a really nice place to be, I think, now. I think we're, it's not to pat ourselves or pat Microsoft on the back too much, but I think it's a much nicer place to work. I remember maybe sort of 6 or 7 years ago saying to some of my, some of my friends or acquaintances and saying, I'm a developer. I'm working Microsoft technologies, and there'd be the sharp intake of breath. Ooh, well, I work in Linux, and you're all right. You're all right. Enjoy that. Yeah. Just that shout chmod 777 at them. How'd you like that? Yeah.
RM-RF. No,
yes. -R-F.
That's the one.
Yeah. No, I don't advocate doing any of these things, by the way. You should. File security is important. Don't chmod 777 everything, please.
No, of course. Exactly. But yeah, I think that's an important thing to point out, though, that there is... I feel like that with certain technologies and certain programming languages, certain frameworks... I'm not using the word framework to implicate Microsoft in any way, but certain different technologies that are used in the development space, it feels as though they can very easily become siloed. And when you become siloed and you don't let any ideas in from the outside world, you stagnate. And I'm not trying to say that's what happened with framework, but by allowing the ideas in for to make an easy to use command line interface. Like you were saying there, Linux people and Unix people, technically Mac OS people, like to use a command line interface because it's all right. Discoverability is hard, right? You need to do .NET and then type in help to get a list of some of the commands, and then for each step down that tree, you maybe need to do help again to get the next level of commands, and then the next level of commands, and then the next option. So you can figure out .NET publish. Where do I publish it to? .NET publish. How do I publish it for Windows? How do I publish it for Mac? But once you've got that, like you said, you can script it, and then you can do things like piping the output of one command directly into another, and then you have this chain of commands that almost no one can decipher, but that when you run it, you get a bunch of things come out the other end, and it looks great. There's one that I use for testing. There's a .NET test command, and I can't remember it offhand, where it will run the test, get the coverage of your test, pass it into an app that then will read it and then produce a chart for you to show you where, which bits of code are covered and which bits aren't, and the difference between the previous time you ran it and now, or maybe it can connect to the web and read your previous state. And it's really quite useful. And just being able to do that with a couple of commands, for some people, working in the command line is not for them. But what's great about that is because it's the command line, you can change Visual Studio to call the command line. And then if you're happy clicking some, going through some menus and finding it that way, fantastic.
Yeah. Add some pre or post build events if if you're so inclined.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sorry, it's totally skipped my mind. I had a really interesting thing to say, obviously, and now I've forgotten it. Obviously, it was really interesting because I can say that, and it's anyway.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about core, but what about 5, 6, 7? I'm just showing that I can count now. What we got .NET Framework, .NET Framework 4 point whatever, .NET Framework 4.5, 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, 0.8.1, 0.8.2, .NET 5. I feel like this is becoming more a discussion about version numbers, but what the heck?
Well, you mean the fact that we've gone from we've had .NET Core 2, .NET Core 3, 3.1. I know there's a Core 2.1 into a 0.2, but Core 3, Core 3.1, .NET 5. What's going on?
Yeah,
what's that all about?
Clearly, it can't be a Windows 9 issue, right? That can't be it at all.
Well, Jamie.
Oh, dang it.
Oh, dang it. No, we may jest, but I think it was actually a sensible call from Microsoft, was that. There's so much history and there's so many apps running on versions of .NET Framework 4.x. To have a .NET 4 would have been very confusing, especially with the rebrand to .NET rather than .NET Core. So jumping straight from .NET Core 3.1 to .NET 5 was although you may there's some questions to be raised about this podcast, obviously, but sorry, Jim.
Well, what I'll say to you, Harry, is at the date of recording, you haven't heard the new intro, so maybe. Yeah.
Oh. I'm in the dark as much as you guys. Oh Christ! Well, we keep distracting each other with tangents here.
Yeah. The .NET version numbers, and it's not .NET Core.
It was a wise, a good thing to do for them to do. But the LTS cycle is
2 years.
So it's even. Is it even numbers going on from now? So 3.1 is an LTS, confusingly. Core 3.1 is an LTS, confusingly, but even numbers starting from 6 will be LTS.
That was my interview with Harry Bellamy about the differences between supporting both Greenfield and Brownfield applications in both .NET Core /5 and .NET Framework. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff that we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show, and there will be a link to them in your podcatcher. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. Head over to .netcore.show/subscribe for ways to do that. And to come back next time for more .NET goodness. See you again real soon. See you later, folks. .NET Core Podcast is a production of RJJ Software Limited.